Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special session here, and our special guest all the way from California is Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, who has many, many other credits to his life that we will get into in a second. But I first want to say, hi, Eric, and can you hear us?
Well, I can hear you great, and I know exactly where you are, and I'm sorry I'm not there.
So, Eric, what I wanted to do was, you are, for my money, the most intelligent person who understands technology and power and politics and geopolitics and how they all mix together. And you've written 2 major books on artificial intelligence now, in addition to funding a series of companies. But there's a special connection here, which is 2 years ago, you came to this conference, and you I think it's fair to say, began to feel very strongly about the cause of Ukraine and wanted to do things to help, and have been on the battle lines many times. And in that process, you must have seen how warfare has evolved, and the role of drones and the role of AI. So what I was wondering is if you can give us a little bit of a sense of what you've been doing, how you have come to understand the war in Ukraine, given your unique perspective of understanding technology so well.
Well, thank you, Fareed. And I got into this because of you and Victor, so I am eternally grateful for you all to give me an important and interesting problem to work on. And it's important on many, many levels. It's important to defend freedom and fight tyranny. It's important to promote innovation. It's important to keep civilians safe. And I have been struck in the war about how hard war really is. You can think of us roughly in 3 phases. The first phase in Ukraine was the shock and surprise, the valiant defense of the country by people who were not really prepared to do so, but they did so out of patriotism and held the line. You have a second phase where essentially Ukraine got Kyiv back and a whole bunch of other places. That was about a year, and things were relatively stable. And during that time, what we saw was the innovation engine on the Russian side running, right? And Russia does not appear to have a limit on its capacity to build military weapons and create problems for Ukraine right now. And now we're in a third phase where there's overmatch in certain situations. So, for example, the 3-to-1 ratio between artillery on the Russia side versus the Ukrainian side, this crazy dithering in the West politically about why it's important to fight for freedom and democracy, which makes no sense to me. Maybe you can explain it to me. But most importantly, this is the war that is going to define the structure of future wars, because you're seeing the complete invention of a new set of tools. This is roughly the equivalent of the invention of the tank in World War I, or the invention of the long rifle 200 years ago. And if you take a look at what's happening, my rhetorical question is, the U.S. has thousands and thousands of Abrams tanks sitting in storage somewhere. Why? Why not just chop them up? Because you're not going to be using tanks. You're going to be using drones and other solutions like that. If Ukraine had had the FPV drones and the longer range drones that it has today, that it's developed so valiantly, in my view, the invasion would never have started. So if you think of it in the following goal, first, we want to preserve the integrity of the democracy of Ukraine, but we also want to prevent future land wars. And I think it's now possible to see a path to do that.
Explain that. What is it about the drones that makes it possible to do that? Expand on that last idea.
Well, let's take a look at, maybe I could reframe your question to talk about Kursk, because Kursk is very interesting. Kursk is the first time either Ukraine or Russia has used what Americans call a combined arms maneuver. And what they did is they very cleverly did a whole bunch of things together. So, for example, they started by shooting down the enemy drones, and they cleared a corridor. And then they did other things to basically make sure that they had a place where they could cross. And then eventually, with Bradley fighting machines and other sort of armored vehicles, they managed to get through the minefields. Once they were through the minefields, they were able to gain quite a bit of strategic value. I don't know why they decided to invade Kursk. Maybe that has been discussed in the YES conference. But one possible answer is to make it hard for the current fixed lines to be frozen forever. I don't really know. But the important thing is the Ukrainians learned something new. And to me, it's the combination of everything. I used to think that drones, again, as a civilian, I always thought that drones would solve everything. I now understand that militaries defend and attack based on combined solutions of everything they have, and they start with drones and electronic warfare. The historic problem for the US and the West is we've never tested, we've never confronted the difficulty of crossing the Russian EW. The Russians have this enormous network of electronic warfare things which are very, very good. And it's not just GPS spoofing and jamming, it's blocking frequencies and so forth. So the sum of all that means that in the future, drone wars in general will include drones, and the drones will be automated in the sense that they will operate together. In my view, they will ultimately use reinforcement learning, which is a part of artificial intelligence, to learn the right tactics. So think of it as the drones start, and the drones are flexible, and the drones solve the problem, whatever it is, defensive or offensive.
So if this is going to look like more and more like a drone warfare, what does it look like Russia versus Ukraine? What are the comparative correlation of forces on the Russian side and the Ukrainian side?
So last year, I spent quite a bit of time in Prokhorovsk and Chasivar, which are now under heavy bombardment. And a year ago, the Russian drones were scarce. They were typically DJI-3 drones, Mavic 3 drones, and the Ukrainian drones were being produced. In the last year, Russia has created drone factories in places that are far away to essentially overmatch in terms of drones as well. So it doesn't. I originally thought that the Ukrainian strategy was so swift and the Russians were so slow that the Ukrainians would be able to stay ahead. And that turned out to be, unfortunately, not correct, because the Russians have this ability to churn at scale. And using their allies such as Iran and North Korea, they've actually built very, very powerful drone-based systems. So one way to think about it is we went from having essentially no drones in the battlefield, it's called the FLOT, to having Ukrainian drones mostly with Russian artillery. Now we have a crowded field over the FLOT where it's so dangerous in that area, that roughly 15-kilometer area, that the soldiers who are in bunkers can only go during the few minutes between dusk and dawn, which occurs every 12 hours. And the reason is at night, the thermal cameras are so good, you get bombed. During the day, the video cameras are so good, you get bombed. The sort of general saying is that if you look up and you see a drone within 2 to 3 minutes, you're dead. And that gives you a sense of how the world has changed. That is not something we've heard in other wars for all sorts of reasons. One of the questions that I don't know the answer to, and again, you and I have spoken about this privately before, is what does it look like when you have two countries that are in a real kinetic war, such as these two countries, where both of them have the same weapons and the same approaches? What is the deterrence? And if you think of Ukraine, the Ukraine war as a failure to deter Russian aggression, how will we deter Russian aggression in the future, given the enormous investment that they have made in these very modern technologies? I'm extremely concerned, and I've written a whole bunch of articles about this, that in the West, and in particular in the US, we're still fighting the old war, that we're not ready for this new, far more attritable, far lower cost, far more scalable strategies, which are what tech is used to.
So how many drones would you say the Russians are launching every week, and how many the Ukrainians?
So it depends on whom you ask, but the general balance of power is 3 to 1, 5 to 1, 7 to 1. More Russians than Ukrainians. The Ukrainian drones are typically smarter. They have better autonomy. They have better the last little mile, which is being able to hit the target and so forth. What we're seeing now is we're beginning to see what the Ukrainians call drone on drone. And they've talked about this publicly, that ultimately the drone will fight the drones. And that makes sense to me. And I should say I've learned a number of things in this. I worked with the US government and the Secretary of Defense for many years, and I'm a big fan of the US military and so forth as people. But one of the things that happens when you are in that context is everything is static, right? It's as though nothing ever changes. We have you do this and I do this, and then I think about it and you do it. That's not how war really works. The innovations on the Ukrainian side, which are profound, are being copied within 1 to 2 months by the Russians in a shocking way. Another example is 6 months ago, you had a kill ratio, I'm sorry to use the term, 8 to 1, 10 to 1 humans on the Russian side for every Ukrainian killed. They've changed their tactics to go from these large groups that were essentially cannon fodder, I'm sorry again to use the term, to much more mobile groups, which were inspired by the Ukrainian tactics against them. So if you follow all this reasoning, then I've learned another hard lesson about war, which I did not understand, which is that if you and I are in a fight, which we would never be, I would naturally defend myself. But my better strategy is to create a new problem for you that is behind you, that's somewhere else, it's affecting you. So I have to come up with innovation. I have to come up with some new problem that constrains you from continuing to pound on me. And I think that's the way to understand how this war will proceed.
So if you were, that President Zelensky is trying to essentially gain something on the military side so that he is able to negotiate with the Russians from a position of strength. What do you think realistically could give Ukraine that tactical military advantage in the next few months? Paint a scenario that you think is plausible for Ukraine.
So I'm going to assume that regardless of the U.S. presidency, the U.S. support will continue through the end of 2025, which is what the current authorization means. And I'm furthermore going to assume that the current level of defense spending in Europe will continue to be above 2%. Because of pressure from Trump and Biden, the Europeans have actually increased their military spending, and they are now really helping Ukraine, which is great. When it started, it was just the UK, and the UK has always been on the Ukraine side. So the first thing is Ukraine needs everything. They need fighter jets. They need assistance in training them. They need the missiles to go them. They need anti-aircraft systems. You all are in a bunker deep inside of an important building in Kyiv. You're in that bunker because of bombing, right? There's not very good solutions in aggregate to the Russian tactics. So an example would be that what the Russians do is they send shaheeds over Kyiv, and they'll do like 100 shaheeds will go in. Shaheeds are cheap. The Shaheed 136 is estimated at about $25,000. They're actually using cheaper ones now. These are essentially decoys. And when they show up, the Ukrainians turn on their radars to detect them for obvious reasons, and then the ballistic missiles hit the radars. So that's an example of a tactic that Russians were not using before. We need in this war very effective solutions to the missiles, which are plentiful coming from Russia. The largest damage on the Flot is from the KAB bombs, which are these huge 3,000 kilogram bombs they're called glide bombs, and a fighter jet launches it at full speed. It goes, I don't know, I'll give you an example, 40 kilometers from 10,000 feet, and it's guided by other drones. We need solutions to stop those KAB bombs because they are destroying the people on the front line. It's very, very hard for Ukraine to hold those towns and cities. So all of those things have to happen now. Under the assumption that all of that happens, you still have an overmatch problem. You still need more either weapons or innovation, new drone technologies, or some other way to serve as a deterrent. If you look at the long-range bombing, which is very difficult on the Ukraine side, Russia is such a large place, there's so many targets and so forth. Unless there's a big increase in that, I just don't see that that's going to be enough. Another solution would be to try to amass forces elsewhere. I'm not a military strategist, so I won't suggest specific additional land conquests, but I think it's very important for the Ukraine to hold Kursk and fight in Prokhorsk and Avdiivka, which is going on right now.
Do you have a last thought, Eric, before you leave us?
I think it's very important that Ukraine win. And winning is defined as holding the aggressor, recovering some of its territory, continuing its innovation, and have a peace settlement that gives them a stable future as an independent democracy. That peace settlement will need to include security guarantees from the West in some form. This is an area of your expertise, and I'll let you think about how we could pull that off. But from my perspective, I think Ukraine has a very, very good chance of doing this if everything comes together in the next year.
Eric Schmidt, thank you.